Welcome back. It's been a hot minute. Yes, it's hot. Yes, I'm sweating. Will I be able to concentrate super well? You know, that's up for God to decide. I have no idea. We'll find out. But to the best of my ability, I'm going to try to address this topic, which, as you might have guessed from the title, it is about the 60 Minutes CBS News segment that showcased about detransitioners. And yes, once again, I am late on my response for it. In any case, so 60 Minutes was something that a couple, I don't know how many weeks, but like a few weeks before they aired the segment and recorded it and stuff, one of the people, the journalist people, reached out to me via email, and they were like, I don't know, it was kind of cryptic to me. I didn't really trust it because I was like, who the hell is this? So I was really suspicious of it, and basically what she was trying to say was, oh, we're doing this segment on detransitioners, and I heard from these people that I know, and she also follows them on Twitter, that like, you're like a good candidate for this, blah, 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 blah. And I didn't respond to it because, like, spam, scams, those types of things are everywhere in email, so I didn't really know exactly what it was, and so I just kind of ignored it, and plus I just kind of tend to ignore my email anyway. What could have happened possibly if I had been on time with it is I would have told her my story. She would have taken note of it, but then she would not have used it. And I know this because when I went on to Instagram, GNC Centric was saying about how other detransitioners on Twitter were also emailed by her, and they did tell her their stories, but it wasn't used in the segment that aired. So really, I would have just wasted my time. So I'm like, whatever. I mean, maybe there's another opportunity in the future. I have no idea, but it's whatever. But this video is going to be addressing like the aftermath of what happened, and I want to address like some of the logical fallacies that go on with the reaction from the trans community. And this is also gonna be an extension of my Detrans Awareness Day video, which will be like linked at the end of the video, and there will also be a little doohickey thingy on the on one of the corners of the video that I'm pretty sure nobody clicks no matter how popular you are, so I'm gonna have it at the end card anyways. In the 60 Minutes video, they had like roughly 7 minutes of detransitioners actually speaking. These trans people got angry with detransitioners even being on 60 Minutes. And I think I said in the Detrans Awareness video is that we get one day and then we get 7 minutes on mainstream media about detransitioning. And the trans community every time now has been like, oh my God, how dare you? You're harming trans people. You are putting everybody in the trans community at risk. Everybody is going to die because of you. You're making it hard for the rest of us to get care. And just because you made a mistake and you just blame everybody about your mistake, well, you're just plain wrong, and you don't deserve any sympathy at all. I don't sympathize with any detransitioner ever because they did it onto themselves. They're the ones who abused the system. They're the ones who did all these things. Why does the detrans community just have a blaming problem? Like, that's what you people sound like when you address these things. It sounds so childish, pathetic, and sad. And I have to say that bluntly because that's just what it is. If you were to really be fair about this stuff, you'd say, you would listen to detransitioners and be like, okay, there seems to be a problem here with maybe affirmative care, maybe how easy of an access it is to medically transition. Maybe. I don't know. One of the first things I saw out of Twitter was there was like this meme kind of going around. I don't remember who posted it, but in my screenshot that's on the screen right now, we'll show you who posted it. And basically, if you're just listening, I guess, it just shows like a photo of, I don't know who, but it's like a woman with a bunch of microphones in front of her face, and she's labeled detransitioner. And then next to her is a copy-pasted layering of some angry, butthurt looking guy who's like looking like he's writing something down, and he's just very, very angry and pensive, and he has no microphone in his face, and he is labeled happy trans people. And I wanted to address this first because that's the overall theme of how trans people view detransitioners. They see detransitioners as people who have all the attention. Everybody's using them as ammunition for their agenda or something. And often it is blamed on Republicans and radical feminists. Whereas the trans community is just so marginalized, has no power, no influence on anything. They're just wounded little puppies who just nobody at all wants to give them the time of day. They saw this 60-minute segment as detransitioners are showboating. They're the ones who are taking all the attention away from us. What about us happy trans people? We transition and we're very happy to have transitioned. I think the meme is just does a disservice to what actually happened. And while I do think that, okay, just to be fair, I think that the entire 60-minute segment should have been all exclusively about detransitioners. And I think they should have got more airtime. I think they should have got more of their experiences out, because I know on Twitter many of them said, oh, a lot of my story that I talked to them about was very much clipped, and I think that's a little weird. I think they should have had the entire video just to them, and then they would have another segment on 60 Minutes of just your happy trans people, so then they can have their 60 minutes of fame. And then I found it further unfair that CBS News on the Bay Area segment or whatever, they did a whole thing about trans healthcare, and they showed some happy trans people. So it's like, yeah, you got what you wanted. Can you be happy now? Well, what about detransitioners? They only got 7 minutes, whereas you got more than what you asked for. How is that fair to us? And the trans community had criticized 60 Minutes for airing 7 minutes of detransitioners speaking. Places like GLAAD were like, oh, you're harming the trans community with this stuff. Basically, they accuse 60 Minutes of being transphobic just because they put detransitioners on, and I just think that's a little weird. Like, you have detransitioners just speaking out for once, and you're like, no, that's too much. That's too much time. You're being transphobic. You're being awful. Why can't you get real detransitioners on there? Why can't you get detrans allies on there? Trans allies, should I say. I can understand the desire for trans allies and actual detransitioners, whereas by that I mean trans people, detransitioned trans people. I can see why they would want those people on there, because then it would show that well, I guess to put it into their words, they would likely say to show that sometimes medical transition doesn't work for trans people, and because their body can't take it, or they're petrified of surgery or whatever. And yeah, I can kind of see why they would want that type of coverage on mainstream media. But it's also extremely heavily implied that they would only want those types of detransitioners on mainstream media. And that is obviously extremely biased. I just think that looks really suspicious of the trans community to be saying those sorts of things. Why wouldn't you want a nuanced discussion? Why wouldn't you want the good, the bad, and the ugly of transitioning? What about those trans allies who have gone through transitioning but they're allies? How come they were on the medical path to begin with? What about those people? Can't we address, like, why exactly were they put on the medical path at all? Like, who made that mistake? Like, it points out something suspicious within the whole affirmative care thing. So if the trans allies are saying, oh, well, I made a mistake, I made an error in my judgment of what I'm feeling, and therefore I'm not really trans. But why is it that they had been enabled to transition in the first place? I know the trans community says, well, it's your fault. You went to the therapist, you went to the doctor, and you said that you were trans and you had gender dysphoria and you had all these things that allegedly make you trans. And they said, oh, well, yeah, sure, you're totally trans. Let's get you on to the medical path. Let's get you medically transitioning, blah, blah, blah. Isn't that a problem? Don't you think that's a problem that the medical community just allowed these fake trans people to transition at all? Isn't that weird? Why can't we address that? And of course, I feel as though if those people were on 60 Minutes instead, they would not have addressed this problem that I am going to be addressing in this video. And that's a problem. I wanted to move on a little bit. It still relates to what I was saying, but I wanted to move on a little bit to one of the things that the trans community just kind of regurgitates ad nauseum. Like, everybody basically says it. They keep on claiming we're super rare, we're less than 1% of the trans community overall, that other trans people within the community, one quote is, we are practically a non-existent subset of people, implying that we're so insignificant, or like potential people who could be trans, and they just haven't discovered it yet, don't have to worry about the detransition rate. They don't have to worry about, oh, what if I'm that little percentage? They are pretty much actively encouraged to not even think about it, to not worry about it, because it's fine, you'll be fine, you're trans, don't even look at them. I find that very suspicious for those who are actually thinking about this stuff. Isn't that suspicious to be saying those sorts of things? Like, oh, permanent detransitioners are so rare, so you don't have to worry about it. Doesn't that just kind of seem like you're leading people on to believe that you don't even have to think about detransition? You shouldn't think about detransition. You're trans, don't think about it, just think about being trans. I just find that to be very strange and misleading. Don't you think what's a very well-rounded thing to say is, hey, I think you should look at what detransitioners have to say. Even if I believe that they are a cult, I think you should still look at what they have to say. And for you to choose on your own what you want for your life, because you have autonomy. You get to decide what you want to do. And the trans community often goes on and on and on about how we don't encourage people to be trans. You should have no other trans person in the community encourages anybody else. We can't decide for you if you're trans or not. That's an innate thing that you have to feel for yourself. It's something that you experience, blah, blah, blah. So if that's the case, why not allow them to see everything? Why not allow them to see the radical feminist side of it? Why not allow them to see the Republican/conservative side of things? Why can't you let them choose? Because you call this part of the detrans community a cult. It really shows that you hate them so much because you know that they're right. That's what's implied here. And I know that sounds ludicrous and crazy, but the more you hide something and the more you say, this group of people is bad, this group of people is a cult, you shouldn't listen to them. And a lot of the community says to like trans allies, you shouldn't look at them. They're basically Satan's asshole. You should not look at them. They are Cthulhu. You do not want to look them in the eye. You don't want to give them the time of day. Otherwise, they will consume your soul. That's basically the energy that is given to trans allies and other members of the trans community. You need a full, broad perspective, and you need to, if you can give these members and these friends of yours too, the cult end of detransition, you are saying to them, I am very confident in my beliefs. I am very confident in what I am and what our community is. I am so confident about what we are that I'm going to allow you and even actively give you links to this community that is like basically countering us. It shows confidence, flexibility, and a little bit of vulnerability as well. It implies that you're okay with being wrong. You're okay with somebody saying, hey, I've actually decided that I'm going to be agreeing with these people. And yeah, you're going to maybe lose some people, but isn't that fine? Why can't you just allow that to happen? I think, therefore, it kind of shows that what I was saying before about like, detransitioners are basically non-existent and all sorts of other great and wonderful things that the trans community spews out. It shows rigidity, fear, there's just inflexibility of what you believe in and what you want from other people. You sound very controlling when you're like, I only want you to be paying attention to certain voices within the community and even a little bit outside of it, but just as long as it's not conservatives, Republicans, radical feminists, or detransitioners. And then it therefore it basically implies very obviously, if you're thinking, you're using your noggin, that detransitioners are the ones who want more nuanced discussion. They want more details added into what is otherwise extremely pro-trans narrative. And that suggests that they are flexible. They're the ones who are willing to say, hey, I am wrong. I do want you to see that there are multiple sides to this one thing, and there's not just one way of transitioning. There are other ways of doing it. But then the trans community shuts that down and says, no, you can't do a watch and wait method because that's considered conversion therapy. And any other alternative to transitioning is considered negative. It's considered misinformation. Another one of the things that I saw, like in about the reaction from the 60 Minutes thing, was the community doesn't make you trans. And that was interesting because they kind of do. The community does make you trans. And this was interesting because I saw this on the interview with Grace Ladinsky Smith. I think that's her name. She was featured on Blair White's channel, which I'm thankful for very much. I like that happened. And, you know, mad respect to you, Blair, for doing that. But the thing is, when Grace had said, she had brought up the community doesn't make you trans, and she was just like, yeah, they don't do that. That's kind of strange, huh? But then, in my perspective, that's what they do largely. They do that so much. One of the leading examples is the subreddit Egg in Real Life. That is very much a breeding ground for potential trans people to be trans. Or, people who don't know any better and who have negative feelings about their body. They go onto the subreddit and then they just start believing that they're trans. And I'm going to make a whole video on that. And that's going to be the next video I do is trans eggs. I'm going to do a whole segment on that one. But another thing, and she said it herself, I think what she had said was enough evidence to counteract her original statement of like, the community doesn't make you trans, that's so crazy. She brought up, amitransgender.net. It's just a white background and it says yes. So it's like, it's basically saying if you are asking, am I trans? The fact that you are asking definitely means that you are trans, which is saying very obviously, yes, we are going to make you trans. And then it goes on to explain like, the reason why I say yes is because of these factors, and there's like 5 or so essays on what gender dysphoria is and other things, and I think that's very blatant that they are trying to influence you to be trans because they take your vulnerabilities, like I said, and your body dysmorphia and your insecurities, and then they say, well, that's just gender dysphoria, you have it, so you're trans. I know when people say that, no, the community doesn't make you trans. No, they are exclusively looking at direct influences, and direct would look like, yes, we're going to make you trans, we're going to put you into this machine thing, and then put this thing on your head, and then force you to believe that you are trans. Directly. Like, that's what they expect, but they don't understand the indirect influence of what's going on. To give an example, indirect looks like a happy trans person talking about their lifelong dysphoria and how bad their life is, and like they have all these family troubles or something, and just something about their life really fucking sucks. And then they discovered transgender or transsexual online, and then they looked into it, and then suddenly their life just got exponentially better and improved. And then they talk about how happy their transition is. They love the surgeries that they've undergone. They love that they're on these cross-sex hormones. They love the changes that have happened, and they are consistently very in love. And nothing is wrong with their life except for the other human things that they experience. And that right there is just an indirect saying, yes, you are trans, because once a trans person points out the bad things that happen in their life, and they consider that to be gender dysphoria, it signals to other impressionable people who have the same exact insecurities, especially if they're homosexual or something, or other factors. They'll latch on to those negative feelings, and they'll be like, oh, I totally relate to this. I know exactly what you're talking about because I go through the same thing. And it's very likely because the trans person who's talking is a butch lesbian, or they're an effeminate gay man, and the impressionable people who are watching them are also butch lesbians or effeminate gay men, and so they understand that experience of being homosexual and gender non-conforming. That just signals to them, oh, then I must be trans because I experience the same thing as them. You really cannot underestimate the power of suggestion. And this is suggestion. Another thing that was pointed out in the aftermath of the 60 Minutes detransition segment was that trans people are arguing that there is no expedited transition for trans people. They do get gatekept. They do get some questioning on their gender identity. They do get questioned on these things. That's what they claim. I can only imagine the people who say these things are either like older trans people who have been gatekept, and so their understanding of the trans climate in the medical community is not up to date. So they just figure that, oh, there must be gatekeeping because I was gatekept for my transition. And it's like, yeah, okay, good for you. You were gatekept, but that does not apply to everybody else. And then maybe there's other young people today who are saying, oh, well, I was challenged. I have to question what exactly is a challenge for you in your therapist's office or in your doctor's office. How are they challenging you? Everybody in that detrans segment on 60 Minutes, myself included, we are examples of being expedited on medical transition. They had said, oh, I was only in there like twice. I only did a therapy session like twice or whatever. And they were like, oh yeah, you have gender dysphoria and you're trans. And for me, I only had to go in once for my doctor. And then he was like, oh yeah, well, we're going to get you on it. We're going to do your blood levels. And then we're going to get you on testosterone. And that's just, it happened so fast. And it was basically like they were giving hormones out like they were candy. It was so quick. I was on hormones within about a year and a half of identifying as trans. And the only reason why it took me so long was because I started transitioning right before affirmative care was really took off. But there was still enough of affirmative care that was going on that I was given this okay to transition. But it was also like my therapist didn't question me because there was this movement of affirmative care going on. And at this point, she was not allowed to question me. She was just allowing me to say my piece, what I was feeling. And even upon my mom's request of, hey, please question my daughter, please. I know there's something else that's going on here. Please question that. She refused. My therapist refused to take on my mom's suggestion. And that's a red flag. Why wasn't she allowed to question me? And the thing is, she wasn't allowed to question me because she would have lost her license if she did. Because potentially I would have reported her to her higher ups, and then they would have been like, no, you can't do that. You cannot question her because you can't do that because then she might report us and then we'll be canceled and canned for being transphobic, so we don't want to do that. And so I am not blaming my therapist for what happened to me, and every detransitioner who allegedly blames their therapist on why they were given the okay to medically transition, they're not actually blaming their therapist. They're not even blaming the higher ups, the APA that says, no, we can't question them because it's transphobic. We can't even blame them. We have to blame what's on top of that. And what's on top of that are trans rights activists who say, this is what we need. If you want to see less trans people dropping like flies, you have to just affirm them. And that's the treatment that we were given. It's a trickle-down thing. TRAs say this. The APA says, okay, well, we don't want to get fired and lose our whole job and blah, 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 and our credibility and social status. So we're going to go along with what you say. And also, you have a lot of influence with money. So, of course, we're going to say, yes, of course, we're going to go with affirmative care. And then that forces the therapist underneath, regardless of whether or not they agree with the affirmative care model, they have to do it. Otherwise, they're out of a job. So no, therapists are not to blame here. It's trans rights activists. Was it ultimately my decision to transition? Could I have exercised my ability to say, no, actually, I don't want to do this? Yes, it was ultimately my decision to go through with it. Yes, I admit that, of course, duh. And that goes same with all other detransitioners. They all had the choice to say no. But the thing is, how then do you treat a gender non-conforming person? They are treated exactly the same as trans people. And I looked into this because I know that there's like the trans community does distinguish between gender non-conforming people are not trans, and then there's trans people, and they're different. So I looked into this, and there was a couple websites, even .edus, university websites, going on about how they made up this acronym called like TGNC, which stands for transgender and gender non-conforming people, and they tried to make a distinction that there are. They don't really make it very clear, but it's essentially people who are cisgender, who gender non-conforming. They cross-dress. They kind of act in a butch or effeminate manner. And then there's trans people who have this total incongruence from their gender identity and their sex observed at birth. So they make that distinction, but then the follow-up is they define the terms and then they don't do anything to differentiate between the care that a GNC person and a trans person should be receiving. And essentially what they did was they clumped GNC people and trans people and basically said, treat them the same exact way. So it was ironic that they would say, this is what a GNC person is, and this is what a trans person is, but then they clump them together and say, like I said, treat them the same exact way, go by their preferred pronouns, just go with it, affirm them. And so it really begs the question, how are these people treating actual GNC people? What are they doing for them? And clearly the answer is they're treating them like trans people. So I was somebody who is GNC, right? Why wasn't I treated just like I was being gender non-conforming? Why didn't I get treated like I wasn't trans? See, like, it makes no logical sense. How do you treat somebody who's gender non-conforming and has gender dysphoria? There is no distinction at all. I've seen some trans people claim that, like, oh, well, your gender dysphoria wasn't real. It was just internalized misogyny. And it's like, okay, well, if it was internalized misogyny, why didn't the therapist say, let's look at your internalized misogyny, honey, and not diagnose you or whatever it is, not claim that you're trans, Who's stopping this? I often hear this argument that I addressed in my Detrans Day awareness video, that detransitioners were never truly trans. We were never trans to begin with. And I'm readdressing this, but with more explanation, because there is more to it than what I explained. Some trans people who claim that they're true trans will come up to me and they'll say, I shouldn't have ever been pushed down the medical path. I'm sorry that you went through these things. It's horrible that you've done it. And then they'll just kind of like, you shouldn't have been on the medical path because you're not truly trans, unlike me who's truly trans. And while I appreciate the sympathy that's been thrown my way, I don't appreciate the fact that my experience was still downplayed because of the true trans argument. While they're right that me and all other detransitioners should never have been pushed down the path of medical transition, this is why we're all speaking out to begin with, because of this mistake that has been made here. But it needs to be said that while me and other detransitioners were pushed into a medical transition with no alternative in sight, we were as trans as these true trans people claim to be. The only difference is that we stopped believing in this lie of gender. If, according to true scum or trans medicalists, we needed gender dysphoria to be trans, then were we not trans to begin with because we experienced gender dysphoria? Many of us had experienced gender euphoria as well, which is, for those of you who do not know, gender euphoria is where you are passing as the intended sex, and people are calling you by your preferred pronouns and your chosen trans name, and among other things, like you got your surgery and you're feeling gender euphoria, or you're on hormones and you're feeling that euphoria. We experience those things as well. When we put on our chest compression binder thing as women, we felt gender euphoria because it was like, finally, my breasts are covered up now. This looks like a boy chest. This looks like a man chest. Hooray. Or sometimes when we would wear a packer, we would feel good because it was like, finally, some semblance of what my penis should be, that it should be there. We were very excited about these changes, and a lot of us, myself included, were like through the roof excited about how we were going through all these hormonal changes, and finally, like, hair growth was growing on her chins and upper lip and around her chest and nips and on her back and her ass and her legs, and all this hair was growing just like our dad's. It was just so wonderful and amazing. Some of us were even very rigid, very staunch trans medicalists, and some of us were even trans rights activists as well. Like, how does that not get true trans enough? A lot of us were even like not even in the community either. I wasn't in the community, and I considered myself true trans because I had felt this way very acutely, and I had an idea, a very rigid idea of what trans was meant to look like, what guys are meant to be. And I would even like mentally police other girls who were thinking they were trans, and then I was like, that's not how boys are, that's not what boys do. Yes, that's sexist, oh my god, why can't you just allow boys to be anything that they want? Well, for one, they're not boys. They're little girls having no idea what boys experience. But anyway, I don't want to get sidetracked. When we examine this argument really about like true trans things, we may quickly find out that when many of the trans community argues to stop blaming trans people for all your problems and for your mistake, they do not see that they are in fact the problem. And this is what I was going on before, now I'm elaborating on it. Because they support affirmative care, they enable anyone with any lick of self-loathing and social anxiety to transition their gender or sex. This includes anyone who may detransition later in life. So while they want to expedite trans youth health care, they fail to see that there is less of a filter on who gets to transition and who doesn't, thereby accidentally creating further future detransitioners, to which they scapegoat and deflect all their problems onto. And I really want to emphasize this, is that you have no idea who's going to be true trans and who's going to be fake, who's going to detransition. You have no clue. And even if you got a trans person to be a therapist for, you know, your gender clinics, they have no idea either, because their experience is miles apart from these kids who are going through something like maybe slightly similar. It's not the same thing. They have no idea. You have no idea because it's something that's experienced within, whatever that even means. Nobody can determine who's trans. Not even a trans person. And this is what the trans community says. Nobody knows. Only you get to decide. You have no idea if kids who are uncomfortable with themselves are actually uncomfortable simply with puberty, societal expectations, or because of their false yet obsessive idea of what gender is to them. How do they know that they're trans? How do you know that they're trans? Because they said so? Detransitioners also said so. I said so. It begs the question, what is true trans? Is being able to survive surgery and not feel phantom limb syndrome considered true trans? Is being able to withstand the manual hormonal imbalance true trans? The definition, in my perspective from where I'm standing, is do or die. Live by the trans blade, die by the trans blade. If you quit, you're weak and a wannabe. You're especially weak and a wannabe if you complain that you went down this path and you made a mistake. Looking at the path guidelines for transition, they even acknowledge that there is a 1 to 1.5% detransition rate between males and females, but they fail to accommodate them in their whole guidelines thing. They fail to factor in how to not only detect but treat patients who later detransition. The simple reason being that they have no idea what trans actually is, what it looks like, anything, any details. They don't know what trans is because I want to emphasize again, there is no such thing as a solid definition of what trans is. On the WPATH thing and other trans resource websites, it all says trans is an incongruence between your sex and what you, I don't know what gender is anymore. What you think, like how you present yourself or whatever. There's an incongruence of that. But what does that mean? Because then you have to look into what the hell is gender? What's gender? Nobody cared what gender was several decades ago. They just were what they were. Boys and girls were males and females. How can anyone determine who will benefit from medical transition and who won't? You can't blindly trust the word of a patient because they might detransition. You have zero way of knowing who will persist and who won't. Just because they might have experienced gender incongruence since the age of like 3 or 4, that still doesn't mean anything, because I've seen detransitioners who've had these feelings, this gender dysphoria, since that young, and then they later detransitioned and said, hey, I'm actually just a butch lesbian, or hey, I'm actually just a feminine gay guy. And WPATH itself admits that those who commonly experience gender dysphoria are gays and lesbians. Isn't that like kind of suspicious? And then on top of that, they also say there's a comorbidity of disorders such as conduct disorder, substance abuse, dissociative identity disorder, borderline personality disorder, sexual disorders, and disorders of sex development, which I can only assume is intersex. Which intersex is no longer considered a medical condition anymore, and is now being used as proof that there is more tangible, rooted evidence that trans stuff is real, because sex is also a spectrum. Isn't that also suspicious? You get like a conduct disorder, a sexual development disorder, like isn't that a little suspicious? You can't just be like, oh well, I have this conduct disorder and I'm also trans because I'm just like a regular human being. No, it's just that no. You have to look into, what if this conduct disorder is part of it? What if it had made you think that you're trans? In conclusion to all of this, for the trans people who complain The detransitioners just merely exist and they want to say stuff, but they're just being too loud. The thing is, if you want to see less detransitioners, you should not be supporting affirmative care. Because affirmative care is what makes detransitioners in the future. I know you don't think that, but because, as evidence yours truly has gone through, this is the byproduct of affirmative care. You get people who don't actually need it. And the trans people who just have a huge bone to pick with detransitioners. Why do you think it's a good strategy to be so blatantly rude and so hateful and so vitriolic to detransitioners when isn't it like you experience bullying and harassment from everybody else in your life? Why are you taking the hatred that you receive from others and putting it on to detransitioners? Don't you want to be loved? If you want to see less detransitioners, if you want to hate them less, just stop hating on them, because the more that you hate on them, the more that they will also get angry and do their own research and start speaking out more. That's what happens when you hate them. They do exactly what you don't want them to do because of your actions. And it's just a really poor strategy that I'm seeing within the trans community. And I don't get it. What's the point? The more you resist detransitioners, the more they persist. The more you hate, the more your failure is going to end up being. I hope I made my point on why we need to abolish the affirmative care model. Because if we didn't have the affirmative care model, I wouldn't be sitting here and talking about it. You wouldn't see other detransitioners sitting here and talking about it. We need gatekeeping. We absolutely need it. You need to be taking care of these suicidal trans people. Stop telling them that they're part of a huge, allegedly huge statistic of suicide and attempted suicide for trans people. Stop saying that. Shut up about it. Nobody needs to know about it. Especially trans people or potential trans people. They do not need to know it, because then it just inspires them to want to commit suicide anyway. Start giving trans people adequate care. Even if we don't know what trans really is, at least try alternative methods. Shrink down that number of detransitioners. Try to do it. Like, I really want that to make sense to people. I just want to drive it into people's heads that the more gatekeeping you have, the less detransitioners are going to come out and start being turfy and cultish. Does that make any sense? I hope it makes sense to me. I hope it makes sense to you, because it's absolutely critical and necessary. You can't have your cake and eat it too. And by that, I mean you can't have affirmative care and then just expect no detransitioner to ever come out of it and start complaining. So yeah, that's my piece on this. And I really hope that I drove my point home and I didn't repeat myself too much. That's it. I'll see you when I see you later. So goodbye.